Good morning, Dave Baldwin here with episode number 4 of our Introverts in Business podcast, brought to you by our first inaugural sponsor, the Center for Excellence. And again, joining us for the 4th time, we have Martin Brossman, professional success coach, and we have Dan Scala, the founder for the Center for Excellence. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about planning and execution in business. It's a really rich topic that I'm looking forward to delving into here. As we all know, there's a lot of planning that goes into any new endeavor. And there's a lot that goes into the execution of a good plan, even when it's a good plan. And those of you who know me know that in 2007 was the first time I ever tried to start my own business. And I say try because it was an unsuccessful attempt in a lot of different ways. And I went and I made a decision to start my own business without really much knowledge, without any kind of a viable plan, without any track record in business. And long story short, I crashed and burned. A couple of years later, I had just basically a personal financial collapse. I used to think that it was because of my lack of a plan and because I executed too soon. But looking back on it, I think that part of the problem that I ran into was that I executed poorly. And that regardless of how good a plan I might have had at the time, my execution just really needed improvement here. And so part of my issue was the fact that I didn't start executing soon enough. But that's just my perspective, and today we're going to focus on getting some more perspective from our panelists here. But just to kick things off, I want to share one nugget of insight that I got out of a book called Great by Choice. The author is Jim Collins. Some of you might be more familiar with his more famous book. It was called Good to Great. And Great by Choice specifically focuses on startups. And he, in that book, compares some more successful startups, companies like Microsoft and Southwest Airlines during their initial inception phase versus some less successful startups. And one of the concepts that he talks about in the book is called firing bullets before you fire cannonballs. And the basic concept is this: it's that when you have a new idea, when you think something sounds viable on paper, you find a low cost, low risk, and low distraction way to test out the idea, such that if it fails, then you haven't really lost much and you've still learned some information from that. And this podcast is something I feel is a good example of that. A few weeks ago, when we decided to pull the trigger on this, a podcast is a nice and easy, viable way to just test something out, because it doesn't really cost anything to get this started. Anybody can start a YouTube channel. Anybody can set up a microphone and fire it up. And I already knew from the beginning that if this turned out to be a complete flop, I could pull the plug on the YouTube channel and it really would be no harm, no foul. So those are the kinds of things that I want to really delve into today. But I have some questions for the panel today. And specifically, Dan, I've got some questions for you about your experience. And Martin, I've got some from you. You can both chime in on each other's questions. But there's a couple of things that you both have done that I wanted to talk about from a standpoint of planning and execution. So Dan, we'll start off with you.
Okay.
You shared in our first episode a few weeks ago about how in the 90s, when you left your corporate job, you decided to start a consulting business based on the idea of working part-time for a handful of companies as a fractional executive instead of working full-time for one company. Now, my question for you was, how much time did you spend planning that when you first came up with the idea before you got into action and started executing?
Actually, the correct sequence of events was when I lost my corporate job. My first decision was I was going to go out and try to buy a company, because I'd started companies before and knew how much work it is and didn't really believe that I wanted to go through that much work again. So I went out and tried to buy a company. When that didn't work, I went to one of my mentors, and I had 2 mentors at that time. And I went to one of my mentors and asked him, said I knew I had some skills and abilities and that I could take the marketplace. And he's the one that gave me the idea. Says, Dan, look, nobody's going to hire you at the executive salary you were at in corporate America, but try this idea on. Go see if you can get 5 companies that are in a business similar to yours and see if they'll put you on retainer for 1 day a week for 20% of what your pay has got to be. I said, wow, what a brilliant idea. So I took that idea and actually I didn't do that much planning. I just went right into execution. Once he gave me that idea, I went down to I found out where I could get the list from of all the companies that were in the manufacturing business. And at that time it was the Chamber of Commerce, and they sold a little disc that had for $75 I could buy all the companies in Wake County that were in the manufacturing business. So I went down there and bought that disc, went home, and at that time we didn't have email. It was called mail merge, Microsoft. And so I put up a little letter and I sent it out to the 222 companies that were in the manufacturing business. And I waited 2 or 3 or 4 days and only got one response. So I said, wow, that didn't work. I called on that one company and they didn't actually need my service. So I said, I need to take a more direct approach. So what I did was, again, not that much planning, just really in execution mode, because I knew I had to operate quickly. I went back to that list and picked out 32 companies that were directly related to the electronics manufacturing business. And then I looked up who their chief executive officer was, or their plant manager, or whoever president was in our area, got their address and just went and started knocking on their doors, and would go in till I could get some of them to see me. And within 2 more weeks, I had called on 13 of them personally and actually landed 3 contracts. So I'd replaced 60% of my income just by being engaged and being in action and believing in the idea that my mentor had given me. And so that's how it got started for me.
All right, now Martin, you at some point decided you were going to become a coach, and I know you had a previous career doing some other things, but at the point when you decided you wanted to become a coach, how much planning would you say went into that?
Well, you know, I was working at IBM and had just become divorced from the practice marriage, and was at that point realized I need to do something else. I was completely burned out on this, and I thought, well, I really want to get into coaching. I'd spent several years training in it, setting it up. My background was in computer support, so I started building up a side PC business, and I came up with door hangers. And before I left IBM, I could put door hangers out, and I figured out how many door hangers I'd put up that would get so much work. And so I kind of proved that little test, that if I put up so many door hangers, I'd get so much work. I went, this is something I can scale up. And then I eventually left, and I'd been a contractor before I left. And I just would shag the door hangers and build it up. And then I started building up the coaching business on the side. So the PC was the feeding myself with the door hangers. Then the coaching was on the side. Then when I built up the coaching business that I thought I could let go of the PC, Will Jocelyn was a great guy I would go to when I got stuck working out of a repair shop. And they closed down, and I sold him my business with the discounted rate if he hired me as a coach, because I knew he didn't know what coaching was. And I wanted the success story of that. So he goes, you're going to give me a discount if I include you in the coaching, because I knew it wasn't something he saw as value because he didn't know about it. Anyway, long story short is he built up the business, and now he's retiring from it and are selling it. Excellent business. And I think he said he still uses the door hangers from time to time. And this was back in '95.
Wow.
So, you know,
Great story.
And he's done a great job. He did a fantastic job, loved his customers. He really is a better technician than I was. I was better at taking care of the customers and then finding someone I needed to get help on and get the help. And that's how I built it up. So it's one of those, if you can build something up to feed you, sometimes you have to go to what I call feeder job as an interim job to build things up. I just met somebody in New Bern where getting burned out at the part-time job that doesn't pay much. We need to move over to another one that pays maybe about the same, but it's more closer to where he wants to be, and then build up from there. And I call those feeder jobs, because what the big thing is, plan and execution is, like you said, you've got to do small tests to see if someone's willing to take their wallet out. Just because they say they want healthy potato chips doesn't mean they're buying healthy potato chips. So you got to do tests as much as possible to see, how can we see if someone will remove their wallet or purse, open their purse, and spend money on something. And the other thing to me is, in retrospect, it's always good to have proof of concept. When I was in the clone business, computer clone business, computer directions. We competed with IBM and everything else. The goal was to be as close to our competition physically as possible and study what they do. And the challenge I see is when people have, I have an idea no one's thought of, it's fantastic, is you have a problem, you have an idea no one's thought of. If it's 10% or more outside people's reality, then you better tie it to something in their reality or you're not going to sell it.
So you're basically talking about if you're selling a disruptive product or something where there's no established recognized need for the service,
right?
They're not likely to see value in it.
Right. So in your plan, part of your plan is going to have to say it's like, and people don't like, they want to be all unique. Where they say 7 billion people thinking they're unique isn't very unique.
Or where they say it, if on this planet, if you're 1 in a million, there's 6,000 more like you.
Right. That's it.
Yeah.
But that's to me the best. So plan, first of all, planning's excellent. It's very important, but make sure you're doing something that's making you a little uncomfortable and putting you at a little bit of calculated risk. Otherwise, I'm suspicious of your addiction to planning, not execution.
Yeah.
And, which is very common because it's so safe to plan. It's like safe to go to networking meetings and plan and never actually execute is the biggest risk.
Yeah. No, that
see.
makes sense. And I think what I like about what you're saying also about testing and experiments is that seems to be the marriage of planning and execution is let's do a test. Let's test this against reality. Let's see how the market actually responds to this, as opposed to my idea in my head of how I think they're going to respond.
Yeah, and even in the crowdfunding, they got a proof of concept or a working model or something, and a team. That's it.
So Dan, we're going to go back to you for a second. I want to talk a little bit about the Center for Excellence, and it's been, how long has it been now since the Center for Excellence was established?
This is going year 6 now.
So year 6. So when you first made the decision that you were going to start the Center for Excellence, or when you initially had that idea that led to this, can you just talk a little bit about what was the planning that went into that before you finally pulled the trigger and said, let's sign the papers and let's get this thing going?
Well, actually, it came out of a mastermind group. And there was 5 of us that were part of, and there was a conversation that took place in that mastermind group about what did the community really need. And we talked about a lot of needs in the small business arena. And so essentially 2 of us, Lois and myself, decided that we could pull it off. So we actually looked at it, talked it through. We didn't put that much down on paper, but we walked it through and talked it through for probably 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, and with the help of the mastermind group also. And then we found this place, and it seemed ideal for us that it had 1 large training and workshop room, 2 offices. So we decided and it was affordable. And the other part, getting back to the point that was made earlier, is an inexpensive test. We talked it up with our friends. Like we talked it up with Martin.
Yeah.
Martin thought it was a good idea. Pat Howlett, he thought it was a good idea. And Alice Osborne and Olala Jenga. And so when we got some basic acceptance of the idea, and actually those folks actually
first investors.
Were the first investors, and also the first people. I remember Lois and I, neither one of us had much interior design talent, and Olala walked in one day and said, "Here's the paint color you need." So,
and I said, "Here's the projector.
Here's the projector we need." So it was really a cooperative community effort. It was a meeting of the minds, and so we were very fortunate in that we had a lot of resources around us, collaborative partners, if you will, founding members that pitched in, and it very quickly was not ours anymore. It was not Lois and mine. It was our community, all people that brought their richness into it, or their giving spirit, to use their gifts, talents, and skills to help our community. So that's and we actually went back and counted up, and over the past 6 years, there's been over 10,000 people through those doors.
Cool.
And I think you raised a really good point about how the mastermind principle plays into planning and execution, because I think sometimes we need other people, to provide the expertise that we don't have, but also to counterbalance our tendency to lean too far in one direction or the other. Because I know there are some people that have a tendency to pull the trigger too soon and make a mess out of things, or you've got people like me they'll just go into endless planning mode and never execute. And I found sometimes that having that mastermind around me will say, okay, Dave, you've planned enough. It's time to pull the trigger. Yeah. And sometimes that's what it takes to move forward with this thing. Like, I think if it hadn't been for you two, this podcast still wouldn't be happening. I'd still be planning how to do it perfectly.
Yeah, well, if I recall correctly, you were our facilitator back at that mastermind, and I think we still got those original pictures where you and Sheila were here constructing our Metro carts, shelving to make the room possible. So everybody pitched in.
All right, so now I want to go back to Martin, and there's another aspect of planning and execution I think is really critical, especially now looking at this from the coaching perspective.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that we've all seen out there that are calling themselves coaches that, as far as I'm concerned, they don't have any business calling themselves coaches. And the question that comes to mind is, and I think coaching is a good example, and any other profession can work equally well, but at what point can I consider myself qualified to do something? And so for a new coach out there that says, okay, maybe someone's thinking about becoming a coach, at what point have they prepared enough to the point where they can legitimately call themselves a coach?
Well, in 1991, where the idea came to me to get into it, excuse me, there was not a lot of resources out there. Now there's a lot of training and other resources, but the big thing is, how are you going to get on the court and develop your ability to find out where do you create real results with people? And that's the key thing. What are the indicators? Where are the results? I developed my own coaching certificate program years ago. I had shelved it for a little while, but called Key Coaching. Several people went through it. Some got jobs with it. But the big thing of me is, have you built the track record of getting measurable results with people is first. Now, if you're going into brain surgery, you're going to need more education and more certification. If you're going into law, you're going to need the law degree. Coaching at the moment doesn't have standards like that, or neither does sales. And it's important to understand this is key. But to me, if you don't have a qualifier like a formal profession, then you need to have proof of concept that you've generated results. And mine was, I worked with a coach, several things. One, I hired some therapists in the beginning, not for me, but to prove to me where the boundaries were, so that I made sure I was not doing unlicensed therapy. Because in 1991, it wasn't as established. And then I really developed my own signature of coaching that's very different than other people. There's a lot of things where you never give advice and things like that, and self-disclosure like in therapy is really against their licensing. It's part of my activity. So I developed my own signature that got results, and that's what I built on, because it worked, and I knew if I could get results. And my coach said, well, how many people do you have to get results where you're fully going to be satisfied you are a coach to charge your full rate? And I said, I need 10. I need 10 examples where clearly it was well worth their time and money and resources to work with me, as though I was charging top dollar. She said, okay, let's get on the court and get it. So I would either do trades or barters or something until I got that results. And I don't know the number I went through to get 10, but it was not many. And now it's real critical when I meet someone. It's a win. I'm clear that I can get results for them before I take their money. And that's been kind of my ethics all along.
No, and I think that's a really good model. A lot of people could follow, whether you're in a licensed profession or in an unlicensed profession, to basically determine what's the metric that I'm going to set, that once I've reached this bar, at this point I can say I'm qualified, and not before. But then I think the other part is that you're accountable for, once you've reached the bar, you then have to start saying you're qualified, because
yes, because
you made.
most of us have some type of internal doubt or critic in the real world that never goes away. I mean, you can, and that's the real world. And so you go, okay, I'm going to stop listening to that now. I'm declaring I'm done. And it doesn't always work that way. But in my work, the real world with real people is, unless there's some narcissist that just thinks they're God, they have a certain level of questioning or doubt in their system. And I grew up filled with doubt and question. So I was the king of how to convince you to not trust me in not having confidence. And it wasn't I wasn't good. I just had no self-confidence most of my earlier life. So I had to, as an adult, learn to develop it and figure out, what does it look like? How does it act? What's the balance between competency and confidence? And how do I make sure that I'm backing? Some people have great confidence, but really aren't that good in competence. And I feel sorry for that. You know, what is that balance in it?
And that actually goes, Jim Collins talks about this somewhat a little bit when you're talking about making that jump from planning to execution and how much planning is enough. I remember that what Collins basically makes his analogy of, you know, firing a cannonball is when you commit major resources to something. And so the question that you have to decide, according to what Collins was saying, is how many bullets am I going to fire before I say I've fired enough bullets and now I'm going to make that commitment and fire my cannonball.
And you have to decide, is it the fear I'm afraid of? If it's the fear I'm afraid I'm not going to look good, if it's the fear of I'm not comfortable with that, if it's those fears, then those you need to just move beyond. If it's an intuitive sense that it's going to fail because I'm not prepared or I don't know the market, you need to listen. And you have to discern about it. Most people, what stops them is themselves. They're too committed to some way of being in the world that's failing them.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, if I had a bumper sticker, you know, they say be yourselves. I would say be anything but yourselves. It's an upgrade. Because it is. They got little bitty internal representations of themselves, and they're trying to control that through life. And then they're gonna, I love what Julia Cameron said. She said, if you want to find expressed dreams and aspirations in the world, go to a graveyard. They're rotting in the ground, unexpressed, because of so much fear of that's not like me, you know. And I've reinvented myself so many times. I can't express it. I do have to look at what my innate skills are and try to put myself in that area. I don't think I'd put myself in a detailed accounting job because I'd go, that's good enough, you know. But I think that's part of it.
All right, so now I want to go back over to Dan for a minute here. One of the things that I know that you do spend a lot of your time doing is helping startup businesses and entrepreneurs find funding for what they're doing. And I understand that there's a lot of businesses out there that may think they're a lot more viable for funding than they actually are. And so what I wanted to ask you to speak to is, from a planning and execution standpoint, what do you think makes the greatest difference in terms of what makes a business fundable or viable for receiving investment capital? Is it having a great plan, or is it having a track record of execution, or what would you say it is?
To me, it's a combination. It's a magic. It's what I'll call a magic combination. It's the people themselves, the team that you have in front of you, that they have character and credibility, that you believe that they can execute their plan. It's their product or service that they have a compelling story around, that, hey, the product and service is really needed in the marketplace that they have chosen, and that these folks that are sitting in front of you, that they have the wherewithal, spirit, the strength, the talent, and the skill set to carry that product or service into that marketplace successfully. So it's a combination of those three things, I believe, that really makes a group investor ready, or makes investors say, hey, I'm willing to back this or back them.
And you really have a great, what I call the 12 pack. I mean, we can't go into all that, but you know, you've got very discrete things you need to address issues of. That's different than a 40-page document.
Yes, absolutely.
And you got, I need to say you've addressed plausibility and research on these 12 things.
Yep.
And I love that. I think that's realistic. You know, because it's kind of like you've thought it through, you've tested it out, you've got the like the attorney told me, I said earlier, the gold isn't the gold isn't the person who came up with the idea. The gold is the person who has the courage, the fortitude, and the structure to bring it to market.
Execute it. Yes, absolutely.
Now, Martin, there was one other specific area I wanted to get into in terms of planning and execution, because I know you teach a lot of social media classes. You've been doing that for a number of years. So specifically for somebody that's out there thinking of putting together a class, how much of the material for the class do you think needs to be developed in advance before you put something on the calendar and start promoting and marketing the class?
Well, first of all, you need to ask the question, do I have the ability to make this happen? Do I have the resource and ability to make it happen? Then you need to write up the description, get a clear description, and I do a mind map of mapping out the basic concepts of the class and what I need to research and finish. If I've got enough of that where I go, okay, I know I have the ability to get or get the expert. Like in the crowdfunding, I wasn't ready to teach crowdfunding till I talked to Dan and said, Dan, will you be my expert on this? And then I had confidence he would, and then I mapped something out, it did my description, and then I was ready to go. So I did not have every aspect of the class done. Then I found out who wanted it, and then once we found someone who was ready to pay for it, I go, we got to get in gear and finish this out. But I had the basic sketch of it, I had the description of it, and I had the expert that was going to help do it. So that's, to me, was the minimum I needed. Again, it's really people in a corporate job that are workaholics, that are accustomed to having a salary and doing whatever it takes to make it perfect, have the greatest disadvantage in being self-employed because they can't let go of what I call good enough. Because in the real world, every minute costs me money. I'm standing here taking care of my parents and some other things, and it's costing me so much to just stand still. And your money really is time. So unless you can get, this needs to be perfect, this needs to be good enough, you really, I don't know how you'll survive in it. And so many brilliant people I've worked with are really not, have to just, again, not be themselves and get that's good enough. And we need to move with this in execution. And you're going to make mistakes, own them and move on. You know, if you got a fragile ego, then this is a great therapy of breaking that up.
And the last question I have, and I'll have you chime in on this in a minute, Martin. I want to start with Dan here for this one, is I've personally found that sometimes the best plans I ever come up with are the ones I don't come up with until after I've started executing. It's when I'm on the court that the idea comes, and there's no amount of time sitting around brainstorming that would have ever produced that same idea. So Dan, do you have any experiences you can share where you've maybe gotten a great idea for something after you started executing it, or what's been your experience with that?
I totally agree with what you're saying. When you are executing, people will speak to you, and the marketplace will speak to you when you're out and about and moving. And in fact, one of my best experiences, I think, is the one we just talked about with Martin. Martin created this class, or he was asked to teach this class, and pulled me in. And
I created.
You created. he created it, and when we went out to the marketplace, when we started going around to the community colleges teaching it, we would bump into folks that would want to. They either came right off the farm and they wanted to create something bigger and better what they had, or some people came out of corporate America and wanted to create something. And so we actually dovetailed the class to meet their needs. And it was through Martin's execution and orchestration of that made it work so well. So I think what you're saying is true. When you're in motion, it's not like we're building a rocket ship. Like if we were building a rocket ship, we'd have 99.9% of the time spent in planning, because nothing could go wrong. We would have all kind of redundant systems built in to that rocket ship, and the planning would have to be masterful. Where we're here on Earth trying to sell something to somebody and bring our value to people that are in a marketplace, then we better be out there amongst them and getting their feedback, because that's where the true rubber is going to meet the road, and that we're gonna actually find our real value is in our execution. So what you said makes a whole lot of sense.
And I think what you said about the rocket ship was perfect, because that goes into what Colin's always said about firing a cannonball. Because when you're at the point of firing your cannonball and committing serious resources, you should have a well-tested, good, solid plan under you at that point. So, Martin, any last thoughts?
I do. I think Providence moves with full commitment. And I think that's where I think good affirmations are wonderful, but the person willing to fully commit and take real calculated risk, I've seen the universe move and deliver sometimes something completely different than they planned. But if they hadn't moved with the plan with real commitment, that opportunity wouldn't come in. And it's the most bizarre thing in coaching over the years of how miracles really happen when you take calculated risk with full commitment moving forward on it. And it's the real thing that I see absent often in I've got the attitude and I've got everything else. I said, where are you taking the risk? Where are you making calculated risk? Where are you moving with it? So I think that's an important thing. One more thing I want to say about planning is some people don't do well writing out plans. And I've really, thanks to Greg Heyer and my work on social selling, I've gotten into getting graph paper and have people taking a pencil and map out visually the buyer or the customer's journey and the product before they start writing, and gotten tremendous success. And that's something I've been doing more in my classes. So if you get stuck in just writing it out, start drawing it out and see what happens. And it's fascinating how that works. I want to add that in with the planning process.
No, and I think the important thing, the takeaway for me about that is that planning and execution are not mutually exclusive. And it's not like there we come to a point where planning is done and now all we're ever doing again is executing.
Right.
It's an iterative process.
It's self-correcting. Okay, now we've learned that, oh my gosh, this opportunity I never expect. Well, let go of it. And I do want to mention something from our friend Pat Howlett. He says, what is it? Fail fast and fail often.
Yep.
Take those risks where you get some failures and really start to learn and get on the court. So
I think the key is finding a low cost way to fail, where you can recover easily. That's really the art to it. So Dan, you have any last thoughts on this subject before we wrap up?
The strongest thought I have is when I started off with some other buddies that were all entrepreneurs, we just literally lived, eat, breathed, and slept our vision, our purpose of what we were trying to do. So we were don't want to underestimate the value of planning. At the same time, it's your life becomes your project. And that's not to say you don't pay attention to the wife or the family or the other things that are important, but your mind is always tuned in to what you're trying to create so that you can create the best thing ever. And so that's the best piece of advice I could offer anyone.
Also, someday I hope you'll do the 30-60-90 system.
Yeah.
Right? So that'd be another show.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to do that.
Because that to me is plan of breaking into intervals. The concept is 3 discrete intervals for moving, escalating. So and you've got a really good system that you teach in the crowdfunding class. So
very cool.
Great. Well, this has been a great episode. I appreciate everybody for tuning in here. I want to close this out with a quote from Dwight Eisenhower. He said, "Plans are useless, but planning is invaluable." And as we go throughout our week, I'm looking forward to another great episode next week. We're going to talk about the subject that's come up repeatedly in these podcast series, which is the curve of competence versus confidence. Excellent. How much competence do I need? How much confidence do I need? So it seems like such a rich topic that we really need to do an episode on that. So stick around, and that'll be coming next week. In the meantime, just get out there and execute, and we'll see you soon.